Picture a 52-year-old man living somewhere in Ohio right now. He pulls in $94,000 a year. He still drives a 2017 Toyota Camry with 130,000 miles on it, because as he puts it, the car still runs. Tucked away in his garage sits a $400 set of golf clubs he has used exactly twice. He has been hauling around $9,800 in credit card debt for 3 straight years. Yet every single year, without exception, he maxes out his 401k. He does not trust the stock market, but his money is sitting in it anyway. He does not trust his employer either, yet he has stayed at that job for 11 years. He covers his mother's prescription copays and pays for his daughter's car insurance. Ask him how he's doing financially and he'll squint and say fine in a tone that very clearly does not mean fine. That man is the entire Gen X economy, condensed into one human being. My name is Root, and I spend an unreasonable amount of time trying to figure out why each generation handles money so differently. If you've ever looked at the Gen Zer in your life and wondered why they act this way around money, stick around. We're about to dig into one of the strangest financial mindsets in modern American history. Before we get into the numbers, I want to explain why Gen X is genuinely, structurally, measurably different from every other generation alive today when it comes to money. This isn't a personality quirk, and it isn't just a vibe. It's what happens when an entire group of people gets dropped into the worst possible economic conditions at the worst possible ages, and is then told to fund its own retirement through a system that was originally built as a tax loophole. There are roughly 65 million Gen Xers living in America today, born between 1965 and 1980, which puts them somewhere between 46 and 61 years old right now. That's almost the exact same headcount as the baby boomer generation. And yet boomers control about 51% of all household wealth in the United States, while Gen X controls just 26%. Same size population, half the wealth, $83 trillion compared to $42 trillion. There are roughly 65 million Gen Xers living in America today, born between 1965 and 1980, which puts them somewhere between 46 and 61 years old right now. That's almost the exact same headcount as the baby boomer generation. And yet boomers control about 51% of all household wealth in the United States, while Gen X controls just 26%. Same size population, half the wealth, $83 trillion compared to $42 trillion. Gen X was the first generation in modern American history to be raised, on a massive scale, without parents around for large chunks of the day. The U.S. divorce rate doubled between 1960 and 1980. Married couples raising children dropped from 40% of households in 1970 down to just 25% by 1990. Women were entering the workforce in record numbers, but the support systems for working parents simply hadn't caught up yet. Daycare wasn't a normal, accessible option. After-school programs were rare. So kids came home from school, let themselves into an empty house with a key on a string around their neck, made their own snack, watched MTV, and figured the rest out on their own. According to a widely cited 2004 study, roughly 40% of Gen Zers grew up as latchkey kids. 40% of an entire generation was essentially raising itself between 3 and 6 in the afternoon, Monday through Friday, for most of their childhood. And here's why that matters financially. When you're 7 years old and there's no parent around to fix things, you learn to fix things yourself. When you're 10 and the toilet starts overflowing, you don't call anyone, because nobody is coming. You grab the plunger. That isn't a parenting failure, by the way. Most Gen X parents were doing their best in a culture that hadn't adjusted to dual-income households yet. But the byproduct was a generation that grew into adulthood having internalized one core lesson: the system isn't going to help you. The adults around you aren't paying attention, so you'd better figure things out for yourself. That single belief sits at the foundation of nearly every unusual financial habit Gen X has. It's the latchkey kid, all grown up, still convinced nobody is coming to bail them out, because historically, nobody ever did. So that childhood basically installed the operating system. Now let me walk you through one life story, because the rest of this is going to land a lot harder once you can see it play out through a single person. Picture a Gen Zer named Walter. Walter was born in 1968. His parents divorced when he was 11, which was a fairly common age for that to happen back then. He graduated high school in 1986, spent 2 years at community college because his parents told him a 4-year degree was a luxury they couldn't afford, and landed his first real job in 1988 at a regional bank, earning $19,000 a year. They handed him a benefits packet and told him to sign up for something called a 401k. Walter, who had no idea what that even was, signed up anyway, contributing 3% because that's the number the HR rep recommended. By 1995, Walter was 27 years old, earning $34,000, with $11,000 sitting in his 401k. He felt rich, and he even bought a single share of Microsoft stock. By 1999, that account had grown to $87,000, thanks to the dot-com run inflating everything in sight. In 2000, he bought a small townhouse for $148,000. He felt like things were finally coming together. Then the dot-com bubble burst, and his 401k dropped from $87,000 down to $44,000 in just 18 months, cut almost exactly in half. He kept working, and he kept contributing. By 2006, he had clawed his way back up to $156,000. That same year, he upgraded to a bigger house for $312,000, with a mortgage payment eating up nearly a third of his take-home pay. His son arrived in 2004, and his daughter followed in 2007. Once again, he felt like he was finally getting somewhere. Then 2008 hit. The house he had paid $312,000 for was worth only $214,000 by 2010, and his 401k fell from $156,000 down to $79,000. He was underwater on the house, but he kept making the mortgage payments anyway, because that's just what Walter does. He kept funding the 401k too, for the same reason. He simply absorbed the loss and kept moving forward. In 2019, his father suffered a stroke, and Walter started covering the gap on the assisted living bills. In 2020, COVID hit, and his oldest child needed financial help getting through online college. By 2023, his mother needed memory care that his sister couldn't afford, so Walter picked up that tab too. By 2026, Walter is 58 years old. His 401k now holds $310,000. His house is worth $480,000, with $190,000 still owed on the mortgage. He's carrying $11,000 in credit card debt that he can never quite seem to pay off, because something always comes up. He needs roughly $1.4 million to retire comfortably, and he has, generously speaking, 7 years left to get there. As Walter well knows, the math simply does not work. That story isn't some rare outlier either, it's basically the median Gen X experience, compressed into a single life. And once you see that, the rest of the data starts to make a lot more sense. There's actual academic research explaining what happened inside Walter's brain along the way. Economists Ulrika Malmendier and Stefan Nagel published a 2011 study called Depression Babies: Do Macroeconomic Experiences Affect Risk-Taking? In plain English, here's what they found: if you live through a market crash, your brain starts treating the stock market as fundamentally dangerous for the rest of your life. Not for a year, not for a decade, but for the rest of your life. You become less likely to invest, you invest smaller amounts when you do, and you stay pessimistic about future returns for decades afterward, even once the market has fully recovered and tripled in value. The trauma sticks around permanently. Now apply that to a generation that lived through 1987, 2000, and 2008, all during their most financially formative years. The Alliance Retirement Income Institute estimates that Gen X has lived through 8 separate recessions in their lifetime. The cumulative neurological effect is a generation that is simultaneously the most cynical and the most disciplined. They don't trust the system, yet they participate in it anyway. They believe it's rigged, yet they max out their 401k regardless. In a word, they're contradictions wearing reading glasses. Speaking of contradictions, here's the single strangest thing about Gen X's money behavior, and this stat genuinely surprised me the first time I saw it. According to Fidelity's 2025 data, Gen X has the highest 401k contribution rate of any living generation, saving 15.4% of their income, the only generation that clears the recommended 15% benchmark. By that measure alone, they're the most disciplined savers in the country. But according to Experian's 2025 Consumer Debt Study, Gen X also carries the highest average credit card balance of any generation, at $9,600. Boomers carry $6,795. Millennials carry $6,961. Gen X is carrying roughly 40% more credit card debt than either of the generations on either side of them. So how does one generation manage to be the most disciplined saver and the most indebted credit card user at the same time? The answer is the sandwich, and no, I don't mean lunch. Gen X is the first generation in American history to be financially supporting aging parents and adult children at the exact same time, on a massive scale. Pew Research published a 2022 study finding that 54% of Americans in their 40s have a living parent aged 65 or older while also either raising a minor child or financially supporting an adult child. 54%, more than half of an entire age group. Sit with that number for a second. In practical terms, that means dinner gets interrupted by a phone call about a billing dispute at the assisted living facility. It means spending a Saturday morning driving 40 minutes to your mom's house to fix a smoke detector, then another 40 minutes back so you can drive your kid to a soccer tournament. A 2025 Finance of America survey of sandwich generation caregivers found that 69% feel financially exhausted, 80% feel physically exhausted, and 86% feel emotionally exhausted. ARP data shows the average family caregiver spends roughly $7,000 a year out of pocket, and that figure frequently climbs past $10,000 once you factor in lost income from taking time off work. Picture Walter again. He's maxing out his 401k because he's disciplined and genuinely terrified of being broke in old age. At the same time, he's writing a $400 check to cover his mother's memory care facility, and covering his daughter's car insurance because she's still getting on her feet financially. Then his furnace died last month, and the repair bill came to $2,300. That charge went straight onto the Visa, because every dollar of his liquid cash was already committed to the 401k, his mom, his kids, and the mortgage. The credit card debt isn't a character flaw, it's a math problem. It's what happens when you ask a single paycheck to do the work of three. Here's where things get genuinely strange. According to a 2025 Schroders study, 24% of Gen Xers participating in a workplace retirement plan have borrowed money from that very plan. Compare that to boomers, at 21%, and millennials, at 17%. Gen X, the most disciplined savers in the country, are also the most likely to raid their own future to cover their present. The top reasons they gave were family emergencies, paying down credit card debt, and managing the day-to-day cost of living. They're not borrowing money to buy boats, they're borrowing it to keep the household running. They saved the money, they knew better than to touch it, and they touched it anyway because they ran out of other options. If you're Gen X watching this, you're probably already doing the mental math on whether you've taken a 401k loan sometime in the last 5 years. Statistically, about a quarter of you have. Now let me show you the structural decision that hurt Gen X worse than any single recession ever could, because this part doesn't get talked about nearly enough. The financial industry used to talk about something called the three-legged stool of retirement. Leg 1 was your pension, leg 2 was Social Security, and leg 3 was your own personal savings. For most of the 20th century, that's how retirement worked for the American middle class. You'd work somewhere for 30 years, they'd hand you a pension, Social Security would supplement it, and you'd have a bit of personal savings stacked on top. That was the deal. Then, sometime around 1980, the deal quietly changed, and nobody bothered to announce it. Here's what happened. In 1978, Congress passed a tax code provision called Section 401k. It was originally intended as a minor supplemental benefit for executives, basically a tax-advantaged way to defer a slice of bonus compensation. In 1981, a benefits consultant named Ted Bennett realized this provision could be used to build an entire employer-sponsored retirement plan, one where employees save their own money and the employer optionally matches a portion of it. Then a very specific thing started happening inside corporate boardrooms across America. Groups of executives looked at this provision and saw a way to move pension liability off their balance sheets and onto their employees instead. These weren't faceless market forces at work, these were specific people making specific decisions in specific meetings, roughly between 1982 and 1995. They essentially said, we could stop offering pensions and just have employees save their own money instead, and that would save the company billions, so let's do it. Over the following 25 years, the American pension system was quietly dismantled and replaced with the 401k. In 1980, 38% of private sector workers had access to a defined benefit pension. Today, that figure sits around 15%. Among Gen X specifically, only 14% have a pension, compared to 56% of boomers. Same country, same workforce, born only 15 years apart, yet a fourfold difference in pension coverage. Here's what that means in a real human life. Walter's father worked at a steel plant for 32 years and retired in 2003 with a pension guaranteeing him $2,400 a month for the rest of his life. Walter has worked at his bank for 37 years and will retire with a 401k balance he has to manage, draw down carefully, and try not to outlive. His father got a paycheck for life, Walter gets a spreadsheet. Ted Benna, the man credited with inventing the 401k, told CBS News back in 2011 that his creation had turned into a monster, and that, in his own words, the system that replaced pensions ought to be torn down. Not exactly a glowing endorsement from its own creator. And this is the thing Gen X intuitively feels but struggles to put into words: the rules changed in the middle of the game. They entered the workforce in the mid-1980s under one set of rules, and by the time they hit 40, those rules had been swapped out for a completely different game. They were told to fund their own retirement, manage their own investments, switch jobs whenever necessary, and trust that the system would work out for them. What most of them are now realizing as they enter their 60s is that the system mostly worked out for the people who designed it. Try this for a second: pull up your own retirement balance, or your parents' balance if you happen to know it, or just estimate where you'd guess a typical 55-year-old's account sits. Look at that number, and now imagine living on it for the next 25 years. That's the exercise Gen X runs through in their head most nights before bed. Here's what the actual data shows. The typical Gen X household has about $40,000 saved for retirement, according to the National Institute on Retirement Security. That's $40,000 for a household that's, on average, somewhere between 9 and 14 years away from retiring. That's not a retirement plan, that's a long weekend. The median Gen X 401k balance, per Fidelity, sits around $67,100. And in 2025, Northwestern Mutual found that 54% of Gen Xers don't believe they'll be financially ready for retirement, while 48% expect to keep working through retirement, largely out of necessity. Now here's something I want to flag before we wrap up, because it genuinely surprised me when I first ran the numbers myself. Gen X isn't really one financial group, it's two separate groups occupying the same generational label. And the gap between those two groups represents the largest within-generation wealth gap in modern American history. Hold on to that thought, because the data point proving it is coming up shortly, and it's going to reframe everything we've covered so far. But first, let's talk about housing, because if there's one single financial decision that defines Gen X more than any other, it's the home they bought. A huge share of Gen X purchased their first home between 2003 and 2008, right at the peak of the largest housing bubble in American history, just before the largest housing crash in American history. Gen X bought right at the top, then watched home values fall by 30, 40, even 50% in some markets. Plenty of them stayed underwater on their mortgages for years. And the ones who held on through it are why 72.7% of Gen X owns a home today. They simply couldn't sell, so they stayed put. Then something strange happened: they refinanced in 2020, when rates dropped to around 3%. Now they're sitting in homes they originally bought back in 2007, locked into a 3% mortgage, in a market where that same house costs roughly 3 times as much and rates have climbed back up to around 7%. They are simply never moving. Gen X is staying put because moving would mean swapping a $1,400 monthly payment for something closer to $3,400 a month. And once again, the math just doesn't work. Now let's circle back to that bifurcation I mentioned earlier. According to Northwestern Mutual's 2025 data, only 33% of Gen Xers work with a financial advisor, compared to 43% of boomers. Gen X is the least professionally advised working generation in America. That's not because they can't afford advice, it's because they don't trust the people selling it. They watched their own parents get burned, watched the entire financial industry produce the 2008 crash, and they know that roughly 60% of professional fund managers fail to beat a basic index fund in any given year. So instead, they Google things, scroll through Reddit threads, and stitch together their own financial plans from 1,000 scattered pieces of internet advice at midnight, after the kids are finally asleep. And for a surprising number of them, it actually works. Fidelity reports that 60% of all 401k millionaires in their system belong to Gen X, the same generation whose median balance sits at roughly $67,000. Stop and really sit with that for a second. 60% of the millionaires, against a median balance of $67,000. Those two numbers can't both be true unless you're looking at two completely different populations hiding inside one generational label. And that's exactly what's happening. There's a Gen Xer who saw the warning signs back in 1995, started saving aggressively, refused to trust anyone else with their money, and built their own private escape hatch. They're sitting on $1.2 million, the house is paid off, and they're going to be just fine. Then there's a Gen Xer right next door who did everything they were supposedly told to do, bought the house, funded the 401k, paid for the kids' college, took care of mom, and ran out of financial margin somewhere around 2018. They have $58,000 saved, and they are not going to be fine. The difference between the two of them isn't income, it isn't luck, and it isn't inheritance. It comes down to whether the trauma of a latchkey childhood produced a hyper-controlling planner or a quiet, go-along-with-it conformist. If you're Gen X watching this, you already know exactly which one you are, you probably knew within the first few minutes. So when you watch your Gen X parent drive the same Toyota Camry for 15 years while all their friends lease BMWs, that's not cheapness. That's someone who watched their own mother get laid off back in 1986 and never fully trusted a steady paycheck again. When you see your Gen X boss refuse to take a single day of the 4 weeks of vacation they've earned, that's not workaholism. That's someone who watched the dot-com crash swallow their very first job and decided never to assume the next one was guaranteed to be safe. And when you catch your Gen X aunt obsessively checking her 401k balance the morning after a market dip, that's not paranoia. That's behavioral economics in action, a brain that got permanently rewired by 2008, doing exactly what the research predicts it will keep doing for the rest of her life. Gen X isn't weird about money. Gen X is the entirely predictable output of being thrown into an economic blender for 40 straight years and then asked to come out the other side smiling. Honestly, the fact that they're still standing at all is kind of remarkable. If this helped explain why the Gen Xer in your life behaves the way they do about money, do me one favor, send it their way. Send it to your Gen X parent, your Gen X boss, your Gen X older sibling, or that one friend who's been quietly holding everything together for 15 years straight. Because the one thing Gen X has never really gotten is acknowledgement that the rules genuinely did change in the middle of the game. The version of them still driving that same Camry after 15 years isn't a personality flaw, it's a survival response. If you found this useful, go ahead and like the video and subscribe for more breakdowns of why different generations think about money so differently. After everything Gen X has lived through, the least the rest of us can do is stop assuming they're being dramatic. They're not. They're just doing the math.